Our focus for the day, the first of 3 webinars, is on reframing the question of consumption from unsustainable consumption to sustainable production consumption systems. Prioritizing production and its relationship to consumption, we believe, helps focus on the intersection of the enabling conditions, such as inequality, injustice, extractivism, obsessive productivity, and manufactured aspirations that makes consumerism and high mass consumption societies possible. Calling out these injustices helps interrogate the idea of, and practice of development, which is indeed something that is talked about a lot in the global south. This is crucial because development fundamentally shapes the throughput of resources, and these, we all know, have outstripped the regenerative capacities of nature as well as society. Yet, development remains largely unexamined in mainstream environmental policy and governance discussions and in the sustainable consumption production discussions as well. We are delighted, obviously, to have today a very distinguished panel to help us think through these foundational questions. Each of them has thought very carefully over many decades, many decades, about various facets of the complex intersection of development, justice, power, and sustainability. All of them really need no introduction, but permit me nevertheless to highlight a few selected facets from their extensive bodies of work. And I would encourage you to, at leisure, go and review their biographies and kind of get a better sense of what they bring, their experience and what they bring. So what I'm going to read now is really a very shortened version of their biographies in the interest of time. I'll start with Professor Rajeshwari Raina. Rajeshwari is a professor with the Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Shiv Nada University in Delhi, in India. Her research aims to understand and explain the interface between development, environment, and knowledge. Questions about science, technology, and society relationships, the politics of knowledge and innovation, and the substantive relationships that underpin agriculture, human and ecological well-being are central to her research. She works across research, teaching, and advisory roles within academic, governmental, and civil society organizations and networks. Her current work and publications on mobilizing public support, institutions, and piloting living soils, inclusive innovation, decentralized agroecological systems, revisiting international environmental assessments, and knowledge-based bioeconomic capabilities draw from and reinforce post-growth opportunities and environmental justice options. She sees her work as contributing to a collective quest for an ecological, economic, and political reordering, prosperity, and good life. Welcome, Rajeshwari. Let me introduce Professor Jayati Ghosh. Jayati taught economics at Jawaharlal Nehru University for 35 years, Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi for 35 years. She is currently a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. She has authored and edited 20 books and more than 200 scholarly articles. I will not read out the titles. I'll leave that for you to follow up. Jayati has received several prizes, including the International Labour Organization's Decent Work Research Prize for 2011, among others. She has advised governments in India and other countries. She is the executive secretary of the International Development Economics Associates, which is an international network of heterodox development economists. She has consulted for international organizations, including the ILO and UNDP, among others, and is a member of the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Economic and Social Affairs, the Commission on Global Economic Transformation, which is part of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, among many other boards and commissions. In 2021, she was appointed to the WHO Council, World Health Organization Council on Economics of Health for All, which is chaired by Mariana Mazzucato. Welcome, Jayati. Professor David Barkin. David is a distinguished professor in distinguished professor in the Department of Political Economy at the Metropolitan Autonomous University in Mexico City, where he has taught since 1975. He is an emeritus member of the National Research Council and Academy of Sciences in Mexico. He has taught in many countries, including Chile, Cuba, Spain, France, and the United States, and has published 22 books and more than 200 refereed articles on development, justice, and sustainability in scientific journals. His research focuses on ecological economics, alternative paradigms for society, and the problems of indigenous societies with whom he collaborates in creating designs for alternative futures. His work is oriented to having an impact on the daily lives of marginal people in Latin America, and very interestingly, in changing the dominant paradigms in the academy. So welcome, David. I must mention that this webinar was conceived in and is organized by the Working Group on the Political Economy of Sustainable Consumption and Production, which is part of the Future Earth Knowledge and Action Network on Systems of Sustainable Consumption and Production. And there are links to both these entities in the flyer that I'm sure is in wide circulation. The online hosting of this webinar is being managed by a team from the Regional Center for Future Earth in Asia, which is based out of Kyoto in Japan. So a big thank you to the team that's holding all this together. And finally, before I hand it over to Rajeshwari as the first speaker, a few house rules. Each panelist has 20 minutes to offer their opening remarks. Following this, over the next 30 minutes, we will invite all of you to engage the panelists with your questions and comments. Please post them in the chat box, and we will bring them to the panelists' attention. However, if you prefer to speak your question, you may do so. I only request that you raise your hands, and we'll come to you, we'll identify you, and speak when you're identified. But also please do keep your question brief and to the point, just in the interest of time. And after this period of interaction, the panelists will again share 20 minutes amongst themselves to offer their concluding thoughts, right? And then I'll come in back at the end and try to kind of conclude the session. Okay, and finally, I must mention that we are being live streamed on YouTube, as obviously, and this event on Zoom is also being recorded. So this is a matter of getting your permission for us to do so, right? Okay, with that, let me welcome Rajeshwari to take the floor. And thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Manu. Thanks very much. Well, I thought you said 10 minutes each of us, right? It's at 10.
That is correct. 10 minutes each of you. Yes.
Okay. So let me just very briefly, well, let's say set out 2 points about what I want to say. One is this, that we know a lot, that there's a lot of knowledge available about what is problematic about sustainable consumption. But the point is that this knowledge is somewhere, I mean, as you read out from your introduction to Professor David Barkin, that it's somewhere isolated in the academia and also with millions of people out there who, well, make a living within the nested circles of nature. Yeah, so there is sustainable consumption that is happening. So how do we bridge these two is a major question. The other question is about the politics of, well, not permitting this kind of bridging, not permitting this kind of cross-learning, right? So you've sent us 5 questions as leading questions, so I won't answer all of them. I don't know all that, but I'll just try and stick to 2 or 3 major questions that you've asked. Yeah. So I actually want to speak about this. That is 2 things. One is, of course, sustainable consumption, but also this idea of the global south. I mean, as a region, yes, fine, but also as diverse production consumption systems, population groups in this region. And heuristically speaking, the global south as, the source of capital stocks and flows in the region that have gone through colonialism, yeah, and are still subject to extraction and exploitation. Actually, a process that has been rolling on endlessly and has gained pace since 1980s, as we know, since the industrial revolutions of the 18th century and 19th century, right? So, especially in the global north, right? Though some of us in the global south, as in our countries, our respective countries, have also done the same. Now, the problem with this, let's say, sustainable consumption in the global south is that sustainable consumption is now seen as an integral part of sustainable development goals, right? And if we are to see sustainable development goals, as genuinely addressing sustainability questions, we have to confront the fact that the idea of sustainability itself has gone through a major discursive shift. And that is something that happens, let's say, in a period of 15 years. Between 1972 and 1987. 1972, the limits to growth, Meadows et al. Report, they tell us that, well, economic growth is a problem, that it is actually leading us through an unsustainable path to an unsustainable world, which will collapse eventually. And they gave it as the next 100 years, right? We are almost there, very close now. So said that endless economic growth is an illusion and it should not be sustained. It could not be sustained. Yeah. So they proposed alternatives. The question that we are addressing today, that was addressed in this Meadows report in the 1970s, and was, well, people found on them, right? That is what the let's say the consumption, sustainable consumption that feeds into this whole Brundtland Commission, and their report does. Yeah, they say that they reinstate growth. The WCED brings growth back and makes a demand for a new era of economic growth, a new form of economic growth, which will be based on policies that sustain, expand the resource base, nature, and absolutely essential to relieve the great poverty that is deepening in much of the world. I'm quoting it verbatim here, because when they talk about poverty as, well, the cause of and also the result of environmental degradation, they're actually pinning much of the blame on us, that is on the global south. They, as in this particular commission that comes 15 years after the 1972 report, by 1987 tables have turned. But that was addressed. Yeah, it didn't go politically or academically unchallenged. I mean, Sharad Lele, who's one of your speakers here, Redcliffe, I mean, there were several people who published on this, who called out the contradictions in sustainable development in the 1980s and 90s. What happened? Well, if we talk about these people, there were also other economists, great economists, and Kenneth Boulding, Nicholas Georges-Curogen, William Karp, Herman Daly, who brought new insights into Karp's, well, concept of the economics of least suffering is evident in several, well, niche economies within the global south. Why aren't we learning lessons from this? Yeah. So this concept of sustainable consumption, well, one has to be reframed in these terms, along these principles of economics of least suffering that William Karp lays out. Yeah, Herman Daly's idea of throughput, that is a throughput that is sustainable consumption as part of a steady or let's say least disruptive throughput, right? So what are these concepts and how do we get there? Yeah. Now, your note also, Manu, I mean, I'm just going to take a moment here to reflect on that. Your note talks about, I mean, how you say the uncritical embrace of sustainable development or development is understandable in the third world, in the global south, as you call it, but is it justifiable? I don't see how it is understandable. It is understandable to a few privileged academics and a few, well, privileged people in the global south. Many of us, many, well, of our own people don't understand, don't get this, well, let's say, it's clearly an ahistorical understanding, well, which is sufficient when it comes to poverty and consumption, right? So there are major questions here that we need to ask about what is sustainable consumption. Given this history of colonialism, extraction, and all this, we need to shift in the global south to a sustainable throughput conceptualization. We cannot do with sustainable consumption anymore. We need to bring back and reinstate Karp's conceptualization of or criteria of a healthy social economic system. The economy as a subset of social systems where consumption, the norms of consumption, the values of each of these goods that we consume are decided. For instance, why have an automobile industry even now, when we know that every drop of oil is choking us, right? So what is sustainable throughput? And we need to revisit this. That is, well, in brief, what we know about well, prevailing neoliberal emphasis on sustainable SCP, as you call it, and how we address consumption and lifestyles. The second question that you ask, well, about reframing SCP in terms of political economy, yeah? Well, Karp clearly points out, I mean, here again, I quote the ecological economists because they're the ones who've actually worked a lot on these questions, right? I mean, who've asked these questions about how these are constructed, yeah? Theories and models that are abundant in economics of production and of consumption too, are all, if you look at the underlying, well, principles that hold these models together. The moment they start, the privatization of gains and the socialization of social and environmental costs are given to all these theories and models. Yeah. Now, how do we take this? How do we take this that this is the way the world should continue? Yeah. So for us, the political economy challenge is to question this. That is, the ways in which sustainable consumption itself is given as privatization of consumption, and then, you know, a little bit of individual behavior here and there that can be tweaked. Yeah. So the political economy of consumption, production and consumption that is evident in, for instance, the UNEP's Sustainable Consumption Program, yeah, or the OECD's Work Program on Sustainable Consumption, 1990s, I think. Yeah, now all of them focus on greener consumption, new eco-friendly products and services, new technologies. They do not, again, emphasize it, they do not address questions of consumption that we face here. Consumption for a healthy standard of living, healthy as in, you know, a healthy physically, mentally, socially healthy lifestyle that is essential for millions of our people. I mean, that many of us privileged seem to take granted. Again, if you're sitting in Delhi, you can't take it for granted because you're inhaling this toxic air every day, right? But, you know, that these, well, let's say, questions of reframing, you know, not just consumption of individual, well, let's say, eco-friendly products, consumer behavior, and so on, consumer choice. Lots of literature on that. But reframing consumption as, well, relationships, as patterns built on the biophysical relationships between communities, producers and consumers, and nature, those are, well, examples, lived examples that are available here in several of our locations. Sorry, am I running out of time? I'll take another minute.
Yes, I think another minute would be good. Yeah.
Okay. So we have several of these examples here. Yeah, as we've in a book that Julian and I edited on post-growth thinking, there are several cases of, I mean, discussions about examples that exist in India, Ladakh and Mendalekha, which I should talk about, I suppose. So, for instance, our consumption in the global south, in our world, in the third world, well, that is often, well, subject to a question mark about how will these millions of people consume, comes from a very apolitical understanding of consumption itself, right? So if we look at, you know, the not dominant so-called apolitical narratives, right? You say you don't see what is important. That is meat is not just, that is, let's say, 1,000 kilograms of meat or whatever, 1,000 tons of meat or whatever that is consumed in a country, but it is per capita consumption that is to be counted. So in shifting it to per capita terms, not just shifting it into material accounts, but also the matter, energy, and information that go, the three pillars that sustain the system. And we have to revisit these. We have to get, that is the only way to shift this out of, well, the current neoliberal political economy framing to a genuine political economy understanding, a genuine as a political economy based on the material energy flows through the system, through the throughput. Yeah. So let's go back to this idea that Bolding poses, and I was just teaching that today in my undergraduate class, yeah, where he talks about his lament about consumption. And he says that the less consumption we maintain in a given state, the better off we are. This is written in 1966. Yeah. Okay. Out of this, and also his lament. He says that I have written these 2 papers on consumption and nobody reads it. Nobody in the economics fraternity seems to read it. The political opposition to reframing production and consumption through matter, energy, and information flow, as well as linked systems that flow through the system, is very strong. And that political opposition can be countered only with, well, very strong measures and very meaningful measures that are available here in the Global South. So the Global South can actually bring several of these lessons on board, and, well, are very important for us for a sustainable posterity, for a sustainable, well, a lifestyle that can engage with production and consumption, bring us all in together as communities that can live, which is, again, like I said, several examples in this country. So, for instance, small example, new emerging, policy actors, subnational policy actors like the Orissa Millet Mission in a small state in India. No longer the centralized, uniform blanket production and consumption in agriculture, but there's a completely different alternative. Kudumbashri, composting of waste in Kerala, international trade in waste is what we're used to, but here's another example. So there are alternatives in this country, several examples. I'll get back to those if I have time, but two things that I have to emphasize. One, that there is a lot of stuff that is available from, again, good examples, good theoretical questions available from about the global South, from economics, from mainstream disciplines and some interdisciplinary understanding. The political opposition to us is very strong, and to reframe it, we have to draw upon some of this knowledge that exists. GAP's economics of least suffering seems to be the most suitable for us to take on right now. As something that we can all work on. I'll stop now. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Rajeshwari. We'll take the questions in the end. Can I invite Jayati, please?
Thank you so much, Manu, and also thank you for inviting me to be. I feel very privileged to be part of a panel with Rajeshwari and David, who have been thinking about this, as you said, for many decades and in much more profound ways than I have been. But let me actually take up this issue about why are we getting more sustainable consumption in the South? What's going on? What's preventing it? And I think you set it out already in the beginning, but it's worth re-emphasizing that this is not really a matter of individual choice. It's not ultimately even a matter of local choices. Because yes, those are important, those experiments, I would say, those innovations, those going back to more sensible practices are all essential, but they really are relatively less powerful in the face of the broader global tendencies and the possibilities and constraints created by not just global, but macro processes and by domestic economic policies. So I believe that we really have to address those if we are going to get anywhere near sustainable consumption. It's not about people in the South changing their patterns and being good, so-called, in more responsive to nature, more in tune with nature. It's really about how to stop those processes which are going to sweep over all the other attempts for sustainable consumption. And let me just give you a few examples. The most obvious one is the global food system. And both Rajeshwari and David have done a lot of work on this, and they know better than me about how completely unsustainable this current global food system is, not only in terms of privileging extremely unviable patterns of production and trade and storage that actually dramatically increase not just carbon footprint, but also are unhealthy, create various other kinds of possibilities of not just zoonotic disease that we are experiencing right now, but a range of other unhealthy practices. The corporatization of agriculture, which right now in India, there is a huge farmers movement trying to retain the last vestiges of an agriculture that would be protected from rapacious corporate interests, necessarily means a shift in consumption patterns. Necessarily, I am underlining that. It cannot survive. Global corporate agriculture cannot survive without changing people's food patterns, changing the way they consume in ways that are fundamentally unsustainable in nature. Okay, and we have only to look at the countries where sustainable production has been eroded by global corporate agriculture. I mean, take South Africa, where you find not only a shift in the nature of the production, but huge changes in the nature of consumption. And you get outcomes, nutritional outcomes of obesity and undernutrition, often in the same household, because of patterns generated by the advertising driven by global corporations, by the shift in production patterns that is engineered by global corporations. And so, food consumption is the most obvious. Manufacturing, again, it appears that this is something that you could deal with nationally. You could promote particular, more ecologically sound, less environmentally damaging patterns of manufacturing, but global trade patterns really prevent you. And in particular, they also do that through promoting so-called quality standards. which are not just something driven by, ISO 9002 and similar standards, but they're also driven by changing the minds of consumers, that things are only good if they are of this defined quality. And, that bananas have to be all evenly shaped. Well, I'm back to food again, but any industrial product has to be of a certain type before it is considered good quality, which of course dramatically alters the requirements of that production and typically makes it not just more carbon intensive, but also more environmentally damaging in many various ways. The nature of packaging is just one example. I have observed in India, it's remarkable how suddenly we have this much more packaging for every little thing than we had before. And it is one of the most wasteful aspects of industrial manufacturing, this excessive overkill in terms of packaging, which again is deeply environmentally wasteful and unsustainable. The role of advertising I have already mentioned, but we cannot forget how significant it is. And it's significant now because the reach of global media, both formal mainstream media and social media, is so vast that people's notions of what is quality, what is desirable, are hugely influenced by the power of advertising. And again, we know where that is coming from. The role of urban and location policies, the ways in which we design our towns and cities or just allow them to grow, the ways in which we enable habitations to emerge, the kinds of public amenities we provide in different habitations determine very, very unsustainable ways of life, which are also very unpleasant. They force long commutes to get to work, to get to more basic supplies, to enable your children to get to school. They force lots of reliance on deeply polluting, congesting forms of transport and distribution. They force all kinds of other sustainable ways of living, which are not in the hands of people themselves. They are driven by the circumstances, which in turn are driven by a particular strategy of urbanization or allowing settlements and habitations to emerge. Really what I want to emphasize is that these are, of course, I mean, you can say this is imperialism, this is global north versus south, but it's not just that. It isn't. It is, of course, the global economic processes, but these are deeply driven by domestic policy choices, deeply. And I think we have to recognize this. Rajeshwari talked about this, the political elements of this. Domestic policy choices are driven by elite preferences. Elite preferences in turn are driven by a very, well, neoliberal is the kind of catch-all term, but let me say by a very global corporate vision of production and consumption and distribution, which is ultimately oriented towards profits, towards corporate profits. And yet we are all kind of puppets being made to see this as a form of, the elites in particular in developing countries are being made to see this as a form of desirable consumption to be aimed for. And that then seeps into the broader society, but most of all, it seeps into domestic policy. I think that's really the devil we need to confront, that we cannot hope to get, and there's no point, there is point, but I'm saying the idea that we can just look at little pockets of attempts at sustainability without addressing this fundamental challenge, I think that is misplaced. And so when we ask ourselves, why don't all these other attempts, Sumak Sumai, the attempt at, Buen Vivir, the short-lived attempt, unfortunately, in Ecuador, various other tendencies across the world, which are deeply inspiring and deeply innovative, why is it so hard for them to survive? And I would argue it's because of these processes, and it's because of domestic policies, which make it impossible to sustain. So I would put it out there, perhaps confrontationally, that without addressing these, we're not ever going to get sustainable consumption in any equitable manner. Thanks.
Great, thank you, Jayati. And I think the confrontational framing was much welcome, very welcome. Can I invite David to take the floor, please?
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here, talking to this audience from the provinces of Mexico. It's very exciting to hear the broad and diverse views that have been presented by the two previous speakers. I would like to give my presentation a slightly different twist. I would like to begin by suggesting that the way in which we confront the problems that the Future Earth group has posed to us is we must change our frame of thinking about these problems. It is not that we have to worry about sustainable consumption, but we have to create a system, a different kind of system that the group that convened us called a different political economy framing, a political consumption system, an integrated system. And I would argue that the best way to do this is collectively, that one of the main limitations of thinking about what we're doing is that decisions are generally thought of as individual by consumption, but individual also by production. And the production is controlled ideologically, as Jayati just said, by very, very powerful corporate interests around the world. But we in Latin America have placed a great deal of emphasis on what we call the collective revolutionary, the communitarian revolutionary subject. I would like to emphasize and repeat this term, and I would urge people to look for information about who is the collective revolutionary subject. This subject exists all over the world. These are the organizations, the communities that are trying to reorganize their way of production, their way of consumption, but also self-management and claim control of their territories. One of the elements, the fundamental elements of this is the switch from talking about agriculture to talking about agroecology. That involves also a care for the relationship between societies and the planet. And that is absolutely fundamental. And the care of the planet cannot be done individually. It cannot be done by corporations because they are interested in fundamentally making profit for individuals. And what I am emphasizing when I talk about the communitarian revolutionary subject is the local nature of the production process. And agroecology stresses the concept that this agricultural process, this consumption process, must be based on the reclaiming of diversity in production and diversity in consumption. Right now, we are faced with a sort of condemnation, a sentence by global corporations which are trying to change our consumption patterns into low nutritious foods and damaging production systems. So the reframing of the problem as an integrated production consumption system is extraordinarily important. It involves, yes, as our organizers suggested, an alternative vocabulary, which means partnerships, synergies that involve cooperation and alliances on a local, a regional, and international level. Jayati mentioned the Ecuador, the Andean concept of buen vivir, which in English might be translated as living well, not the good life. And that's very, very important. Living well is quite different because it encompasses the integration of society's relationship to the planet. I'm repeating myself, and I understand that because I want to emphasize it. The buen vivir from the Andean region can be understood in some ways as the swarak, which was a very important concept in India years ago, and I hope can be continue to spread within the Indian subcontinent. But the concept exists all over the world. I can talk about another concept similar, Ubuntu, from Southern Africa, which might be translated as freedom, but it's a much more encompassing concept because it's freedom to be able to decide what you're producing. It's freedom to use, to approach, to live with the land, with the planet, rather than with commercial and scientifically produced dangerous crops and the chemicals that go with them. Swarak, Ubuntu, and here in Mexico, we have a concept that is similar that's called comunalidad. And millions of people here in Mexico, we're talking right now about 25 million people who are organizing themselves to try to create an alternative way of looking at the production consumption integrated system. The small scale production based on local organization of production and consumption is extraordinarily important because people sometimes don't realize that 70% of the food that is produced for human beings right now on the face of the earth is produced by small scale farmers and generally is locally sourced, is locally traded, and offers a better alternative in terms of nutrition, a better alternative in terms of social organization, and a better alternative in terms of providing for the health of the people that are involved in this process. I would like to finish this introductory remark by saying that one of the exciting things about the reframing that the group that we are involved in today in this panel is extraordinarily important and has been taken up by several international networks of communities, of producers, of people who understand the need for reorganizing our way of thinking. One of them is La Via Campesina. La Via Campesina is perhaps the largest social organization on the face of the earth, an organization which encompasses member communities from around the world in 83 countries right now and has 200 million members. La Via Campesina has gained an important voice on the international scene by insisting that peasant agriculture, and by peasant agriculture, the Via Campesina understands peasant and indigenous agriculture, has an alternative solution for facing the environmental crises that the Earth is facing, that humanity is facing today. And the second international network that I would like to talk about is called Territories of Life. Both of these organizations can be found on the internet, and you can find more information about them. The Territories of Life organization brings together more than 170 indigenous communities in 81 countries around the world. The interesting thing about the Territories of Life organization, and I want to emphasize this in concluding, is that the people who make up these communities occupy 1/4 of the Earth, the surface, the land area of the whole planet. And these people are involved with protecting biodiversity and in promoting a healthful and sustainable production consumption system that is achieving the goals that our panel today is talking about. So let me just conclude by saying the communitarian revolutionary subject, the subject that I began with, is in fact a way of reframing the problem and providing solutions to the crises, the economic, social, political crises that we currently face. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks for highlighting the kind of the role that the reframing of production consumption systems plays in this conversation. So let me just open up the floor now for questions, and please feel free to speak your question, or if you prefer, you can put it in the chat.
It's not my place, but I noticed that Rasigan Maharaj is here from South Africa, and he has a lot of really interesting things to say about it. So I don't know if we can prod him to intervene.
Welcome, please, sure. Rasigan, I did.
Rasigan, are you there? Can you speak?
Thanks very much, Manu and colleagues, Jayati, for putting me a little bit on the spot. Manu, I am scheduled. I will be part of your series later on. So if it's all right, and maybe we can encourage people to hang in a bit. There are things I wanted to share, but a lot of resonance with what the panelists have raised today, especially on touching on those of us in the global south, physically, and the type of challenges that we are being confronted by. It's so critical in terms of noting, and especially also to emphasize, Rajeshwari raised this right up front, Manu. We do know so much.
Yes.
So it cannot be on the basis that our naivety is driving us forward. We really need to confront these things that question the rationality of seeking infinite growth on a very finite rock that sustains life at present. So if that's sufficient for now, Jayati, I'm sorry, but maybe I'll come back in the third panel, if that's the right, colleagues. Thanks so much, Manu. Thanks, colleagues.
Thanks, Rasigan. Is there...
Well, if nobody else has a question, I would like to ask about the quite often growth is sort of everybody here in Europe is saying we have to grow because the countries of the global south need to consume more, and this is being sort of so how do we sort of answer this, or how it seems to be a contradiction, like you don't want to grow, you don't want to let them sort of use our own the benefits that we had, I wonder if there are any ideas on this issue. I know that some of these things, like what David has been saying, could be used, but maybe some other from India or something like that.
Do one of the panelists? I see David's hands up.
Yeah.
David, you want to jump in?
I would love to jump in. I think that the issue that Nadia has, it is Nadia, right? Who raised are extraordinarily important, because in Europe, there is a sort of a new love affair with the concept of degrowth. But the degrowth doesn't deal with the problems that we have to deal with in the global South. I think that what we were just confronted with in Raina's first comment, and what was emphasized now, is extraordinarily important. We have in the global South the knowledge and the resources to be able to improve the quality of our lives without sacrificing the nature of our social organizations. The degrowth notion is that you have to sacrifice your the quantity of things that you consume. You have to change the consumption basket, but without necessarily dealing with the more fundamental question of changing the structure of society itself. The importance of the reframing that we're talking about is that we're talking about the need for people to reorganize the way in which society makes decisions. We're talking about a different political economy. We're talking about the importance of joining with reclaiming diversity in culture that goes with diversity in productive systems that protects the diversity of our ecosystems. And so the extraordinary difference between what we're talking about in this panel and the degrowth movement in Europe that Nadia was referring to is the importance of understanding, the significance of understanding that diversity means changing our patterns of living, strengthening the diversity of our social organizations, our political organizations, reclaiming the fundamental importance and historical role that women have played in this process, and respecting and reclaiming the traditional diets and the traditional productive systems that are so prevalent in the global South and are being threatened.
Could I add to that as well?
Please, Jayati. Yes.
Yeah, thank you. And I think David has already raised some of these points, but I think Nadia has touched on something which is so common in the North, this notion that, growth is necessary to ensure that people in the global South get their minimum consumption, and, all of the sort of gaps in consumption and lifestyle are mentioned all the time. My own view on this one is that, the growth, degrowth debate is a massive red herring, because they're both reliant on GDP, on national income, which, as we know, is a hugely flawed estimate. Okay, it doesn't really capture well-being, doesn't even capture material well-being. Increasingly, especially with more service-driven economies, it incorporates growing parts of the North. The growth is all in finance, insurance, and real estate, which is really ephemeral. That growth reflects, not just ephemeral, it reflects the greater bonuses that finance is awarding itself because of its political lobbying power, rather than any real contribution to the economy. a large part we know of terrible things, polluting, congesting, destructive things generate more GDP than more equitable things. So GDP is a terrible lens to look at it. It doesn't matter whether it's growing, not growing. That is not giving us an indication of a better quality of life. In the WHO Council on Economics of Health for All that I think was mentioned in the beginning, we have a different framing. We're really saying, okay, what is the economy we need to generate health for all? And health in its broadest sense, health of the environment, but certainly health of the people in terms of, physical health, mental health, emotional health. What is the economy we need to generate that? So it's not about whether that economy is growing in GDP terms or not. Is that economy delivering those things? And are those things then improving over time? That's really what you have to look at. That need not depend on GDP growth. It depends critically rather on the pattern of that growth. It's unfortunate that, every country in the world and all the international organizations still dwell on GDP. GDP per capita, GDP per worker as a productivity indicator, GDP as the basic indicator, because it's really deeply flawed. So I think one critical response is what's going to generate a better quality of life, better health of a particular society or economy? What are the things we need for that? Let's think of how we can achieve those in sustainable ways, rather than say, well, if they don't grow, they won't get these things, because we know even if they grow, they may not get these things. In India, we had an economy that was growing at supposedly spectacular rates for 3 decades, and people absolutely worse off in terms of per capita food consumption. There's something wrong there, right? So we have to actually change our goal. And when you change that goal, a lot of these, I would say, false dichotomies, which are constantly presented, especially I think in the North, but even in the global South. Without growth, we cannot give you education. Without growth, we cannot give you electricity. Without growth, we cannot give you housing. That's nonsense, okay? And so we really have to get away from that framing into an alternative framing. And once you do that, you see that that's why I also think it's a red herring among us progressives. Many of the proposals of the degrowth and green growth people are exactly the same. And I have good, close friends on both sides. The proposals are the same. So we should get away from, fighting about whether it's green growth or degrowth. That's not an issue. The issue is really how do we deliver societies that are healthy, happy, sustainable, really, in a way.
Thank you, Jayati. Leila has had her hand up.
Can I just take a minute?
Sure.
I promise I won't take too much time. I just wanted to clarify this. One, degrowth, post-growth, green growth, all of them, they challenge this idea of GDP. So the GDP question is out anyway. But I'm actually a little worried about this what actually both David and Jayati said, but the idea that it's not, post-growth thinking, of course, the North has to reduce its emphasis on economic growth. That is absolutely on. As you said, Jayati, corporate-led thinking supported by the state for private benefits has to come down. There is no doubt about it. Here again, what I was talking about was, in the 10 minutes that you gave me, was about a post-growth thinking that comes from an understanding of the material, energy, and information flows through this economy, through our economies and societies. Yeah. So post-growth thinking is, or degrowth, that is can also be post-growth, is not just about the economy as an entity. So the word growth is probably what everybody is hooking on to, but it is about a different world, a different social imaginary, a different kind of class sensitivity, a different, let's say, focus on needs, Also look at several contributions that have come from India. They're not about economics of growth or economics of the country or an individual. It's about, certain Indic philosophies, Buddhist economics, Gandhi and Kumarappa, Tagore, great work on questions of the economy and growth, A. Nagaraj in India, and several others who've worked on these. So post-growth restructuring is essentially social and political. It is not about the economy as a standalone item. And it is, of course, as Professor David Barkin was saying, inclusive of women, informal workers, a whole range of factors. Why are we calling them informal? Because they're not part of our formal economy, right? but they are the majority, 92.6% of India's workforce, and they are treated as marginal and informal. There is something completely lopsided about the idea that the economy is at the forefront. That is the problem that the post-growth debate is trying to address. And Europe really needs to rethink its focus on the economy. Thank you.
All right. So there are a lot of questions that have been coming in on the chat box. It's wonderful. And there are also 3 hands that have been raised. Could I, maybe we can have these, Leda, Dushyant, and Trishita. If there are questions, can you just state your question and we'll take them together. And then I'll go to the questions in the chat box. Leda, please. Yes.
Thank you, Manu, and thanks for all the speakers. It's quite interesting, I would say, that the perception of the degrowth movement in Europe by the people from the global south. I mean, it's quite wrong, to be very honest, because I'm active in the degrowth movement now for many, many years, from the very first degrowth conference. And it's not focused on only the economic growth obsession. It is much, much broader. I think it covers all the topics that you raised, which makes us think maybe, or should we have to rethink on how to better connect with the people that are now in this webinar, because I think we do have exactly the same objectives. And of course, the majority of Europe is focusing on economic growth, just like the majority of the global south. So we are talking about minorities and of people, groups that are really willing to change the world in a fundamental, indeed, in a systemic way. But my question was also, because most of the examples that you gave was some kind of community-based, self-organized groups of local communities, indigenous people that have another way of working and living, etc. So I think that is absolutely great and interesting. But if you want that fundamental change, I think you also need to fundamentally change the policies. I'm working on UN level, so on the global level, so I know how important it is that on the international level, they have, let's say, their objectives and the targets, etc., that other countries start to implement. So I think that's for me the big bottleneck, because there we still see a very traditional way of seeing things like green growth. And as degrowther, I really oppose to the green growth. And we don't have the same proposals at all, far from, I would say. But it's maybe of the way that we communicate that people are not always knowing what we are doing. But I mean, I would like to hear on how much policy advocacy is also done in the global south on this kind of proposals to have it really systemic and fundamental. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Leda. Can I also just invite Dushyant and Trishita to speak their questions, and then we'll ask the panel to respond.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for all the words that have been said. I have 2 small questions. So one of them being that I myself grew up in New Delhi, India, and I learned about the climate and ecological economics and got into lighter living and everything. But then it's harder for people around me to even understand these concepts. And that's the challenge, that even coming from, I know living in Delhi is still a lot of privilege than someone coming from a small village in rural India. But then it still requires a certain level of transformation. So how do we go about that transformation, point A? And then secondly, we talked about political economy. So what does that political economy look like on a more global level? Because in a lot of ways, I see it as a crisis of imagination. I have also been part of degrowth circles, and we all end up at the same question, that how does it translate into a certain world, or what are we actually looking for? What should we ask for? What should we work towards? Because that is something that doesn't really exist either in literature or around me, or maybe it's my own failing of imagination. So maybe someone else can help me with that. Thank you.
Thanks, Dushyant. And the Trishita, please. And then we
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I mean, thank you for the great points of view. I just had maybe a couple of questions and maybe a comment. One is that I think touching upon Dr. Ghosh's point, I think this fact that, we are definitely looking at a very wrong metric when, we are looking at GDP only. But there's also, I think there's a very strong undercurrent which we do not want to confront, which is the fact that why are we so much, focused on growth? Because we do not want to confront that there is a need for redistributive policies. There are, riches concentrated, and we are only saying that, okay, we need growth because we do not want to part our wealth, which the most of it, which we anyway don't use, and redistribute to the people who actually need it, or below poverty level. So therefore we are we always so therefore, I mean, focusing on growth is basically the easy way out, right? We are saying that, okay, we have to grow because we need to feed these people. So I think I would like to hear comments on that, whether this view is correct or not. And also another, I think, point I strongly feel is that you need to also start a conversation at the state and the national level, everywhere, that you need to have a cap on consumption. I mean, no matter whether it's sustainable or not, you need to have a cap. You cannot be talking about, okay, sustainable consumption or sustainable way of producing, and also egg your population on to consume more, have more, like the number of items. It's not about the quantity, I would say the quality, right? Like there are, as a middle income household also, you own so much these days, and a fraction of that you actually use, right? So so this is again something I don't think we economists actually confront this point. So I think I would like to hear about this. Second, and the last point, I would say that, so on this capping consumption, I think the action points, which I had also worked in Terry, and we had done a project on this, that one, I I'm looking for action points, because a lot of these seminars don't help if we don't come out with something to do. So I think capping energy embodied could be one way to go about it, that per household, per person, just to see that how much are we consuming in total, right? Whether you talk about, clothes, food, your household services, everything, right? So if you do that, and if you're looking at a, circular, what do you call, I think, sorry, so this is the point, that, capping that energy embodied. And also the last point, that I really don't see any move away from GDP, while a lot of measures have been given. And Partha Dasgupta's IWR is, I think, when I teach, I find it's beautiful. I mean, of course, when there are a lot of problems in measuring natural capital wealth, but at least if we don't attempt to do that, we'll never get there. So I don't see any country doing that, really. So yeah, I suppose you can take that as a question. That's all. Sorry.
Thank you, Trishna.
A lot of time.
Yep. Maybe can I invite the panel now, in any order?
Can I
go ahead.
Sure,
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, Jayati, okay. After you, Jayati. After you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry to, am I still muted? No, you can hear me?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So yeah, only because, these are issues that I feel very strongly about. So it's great to get these responses. So Lida, first of all, listen, this is the problem, here you're saying you're completely opposed to green growth. Really, no, there are many different kinds of so-called green growth. There's the stuff propagated by the World Economic Forum, which is completely nonsensical, which is really about public-private partnerships, generating more profits for private capital, getting into so-called green industries, okay? That's one set of green growth. But there's another set of progressive people who are talking about green growth, which is really about exactly the kinds of post-growth issues that Rajeshwari mentioned. And I'm talking about, for example, my new colleagues at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, Bob Polin and others who have done a lot of very good work on this. There is absolutely no reason for conflict between, let's say, a Bob Polin and a Jason Hickel. Really, in terms of the policy conclusions, they are identical. In terms of the things they want to promote, it's identical. So for us who want a new kind of framing to get involved into fighting with each other, I think it's absurd and wrong, okay? So I really feel strongly about this. And I think Rajeshwari is right, that the degrowth thing has moved on. It's just calling it degrowth is unfortunate because, it's already kind of framing it in those ways. Similarly, green growth. Both of these the progressive movements of these have moved well beyond, and we have to stop quarreling with each other and saying we can't stand each other and they're all wrong. Really, we have to stop. I'm absolutely dead serious about this. Second, it's not a problem of North versus South. The impetus for GDP growth, if anything, is even stronger in the global South. In terms of economic policy making, we are doing everything possible in terms of reducing our environmental standards, increasing our carbon investments. Coal investments are massively up in India, for example, enabling financial and bond markets to get into the worst kinds of brown and environmentally damaging and climate affecting activities. So, that problem is global, and if anything, it is even stronger in the global South. The issue of, a different metric, I think that's absolutely crucial. I cannot reiterate the importance of a different metric. And I think, both the UN committee that I'm on and the WHO Council, this is a fundamental part of the project, is to develop a different metric. It's actually now, I'm happy to say, found its way into the UN Secretary General's latest report, which I think was released last week, in which he's also called for a different metric. Now, when I say different metric, I do not mean a whole matrix of indicators. That's the problem we have had in the past. We have excellent, the happiness index, Healthy Planet Index, Partha Dasgupta's IWR, which really is only about the environment as capital, which frankly also I object to calling environment capital, but that's a separate issue. The notion of the indicators brought up by the Fitoussi Commission, the Sarkozy created commission with Amartya Sen and Stiglitz and others in it, which had 17 indicators. Now, why have none of them worked? Because they're too complicated. Because they don't, policymakers can't grab them and say, here's this. Now, unfortunately, we know, economists know that GDP is also a very complex indicator that has huge numbers of assumptions and makes all kinds of leaps of faith. But the general public doesn't know that. Statistical systems have got used to it. And it is hugely in the interests of corporate lobbies, because it fits in so well with the aim of capitalism. And my friend Sainath says the ideology of capitalism is the ideology of the cancer cell, right? Grow at all costs. Grow, just grow. That's the nature of capitalism. Accumulate, accumulate. That is the Moses and the prophets, as Marx said. Now, therefore, it is very hard to confront. But we cannot confront it with a wide range of many indicators. We have to think of a small subset of manageable indicators that people can pick up easily. And what I have been lobbying for, this is a kind of, as I said, a thin end of the wedge approach, okay? So it's not a revolutionary approach. Mine's a thin end of the wedge approach, in which we are going to ask all the international organizations to put alongside GDP one more indicator. Now, I have proposed it, everybody can propose different things, and there's lots more to discuss in this. But supposing we take the median conditions of basic material life, by which I mean housing, employment, food consumption, and health, okay, access to health. These four indicators, and we take the median in every economy. How many people fall below that? How many people fall above that? We just take that indicator and put it alongside the per capita GDP or the actual GDP growth and say governments have to issue this annually, quarterly, as often as they can. That would change a whole lot of people's perceptions if we can actually manage this. As I said, this is something out there, it's all very incipient, but these are the kinds of ways we have to go. We have to go in terms of developing a metric that can be widely used, that can be used to begin with, along with, because let's face it, no one's going to take GDP out just because we say so. as Leda also pointed out, we have to put it in there to make people realize what is actually human progress and whether societies that are supposedly growing fast are also generating human progress in that kind of way. Finally, the cap on consumption Trishita raised, and Dipinder in the chat has been talking about vegetarianism and things like that. So here's the thing. I know that meat consumption, especially is as generally practiced in the North and often imposed increasingly on the global South through all of the corporate agriculture things that I've been talking about, is hugely unsustainable and desirable and wrong. Would I therefore say everybody has to be vegetarian? Absolutely not. Because I think there are many different and sustainable ways of also eating meat and fish, which are centuries old, which can be developed and which are doing the opposite would be, I believe, very imposing of a particular unilateral worldview, which is similar to the opposite thing that we are resisting. So I think we have to have a much more open mind on what is sustainable consumption, recognizing different ecological situations, different environmental constraints, and moving away from the corporatized version of it, which is a much more homogenizing version. Okay. We can oppose that homogenizing version without imposing our own homogenizing version, I believe.
All right. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you. Can I invite Rajeshwari? Yeah. Go ahead. I think, okay. Both of you. Yes,
okay, so very, very briefly, yes. I mean, I kind of agree with Trishita that there must be a cap on consumption. That's true. We should have that. But I'm a little worried about this GDP and redistribution bit. That doesn't help. Yeah, in ecological economics, we have this let's say weak sustainability versus strong sustainability. Yeah, weak sustainability says grow first. Yeah, exploit, extract. Let a few people be displaced, dams or whatever, coal power plants or whatever. Let a few people fall sick, let their lungs die, but we will redistribute them once we grow. That doesn't work. Unfortunately, Georges Curogen writes in 1975, Golding in 1966, I teach these, that the world will collapse under its own heat, under pollution, not resource extraction. So a limit is already there now. We're facing it. The IPCC report is right on our face every morning in the newspapers, right? So we can't do that. That is the time to stop that kind of growth. Whether we call it GDP or not is actually immaterial. Running after economic value added. What is GDP? Economic value added, right? So coming up with an alternative measure that will replace it is only a part-time, a superficial whitewashing. Another metric is not going to help. What we need, there are books, there are lots of works on this. Pluriverse, multiple values and what Professor Barkin was talking about, communitarian, healthy relationships, patterns of these relationships, ecologically and socially responsible relationships. There are examples. These, as Jayati's critique said, these are right now in small, niche systems. Maybe not so many as not so niche as it is in India. In Mexico, they are rampant. There are a lot more. There is steady state Manchester, which is happening right in urban Britain. Yeah, not the kind of successes that they themselves would have expected, but it is a beginning. Yeah. So what we should look for is an alternative or several alternatives to the kind of economics that we have. Poverty is a material measure. Poverty is not just below poverty line, is not just number of rupees per person. It's the measure, number of rupees is a measure that you arrive at based on the energy, that is the kilocalories of consumption that the person has, right? We have to get back to an economics that is an economics, or let's say a measure of sustainability, or measures of sustainability that are based on material energy, matter, energy, and information flows. But here again, the question of information is problematic because it's not really, it's not just a question of information that is useless. GDP is the birth, life, and death of development economics was written, 1969, 70s, yeah? It's still alive, yeah? It's still alive and kicking, and it's still redefining itself as social development, sustainable development, inclusive wealth. It reappears in various fashions every now and then, we can't go ahead without a fundamental redefinition of what is development, what we need to do away with that. We need to do away with this idea of development in, well, let's say in the kind of economic parlance that we know, a sense of well-being. What is it to be well-fed compared to eat a lot? Yeah, we need to ask ourselves this, that is, the measures that we have, a measure is not going to replace GDP. We have to have plural sets of meanings. So the debate on substantive economics versus formalism in economics was fought in the 1970s. Lost, yes, to the oil crisis, to the revival of the economy that was so desperately needed, to the takeover of the Middle East, as we've seen, yeah. All these, we've witnessed all this. Many such battles will be the flailing, well, the death throes of capitalism will actually wound a lot of us. And we have to be prepared for it, but we have to keep on asking for multiple meanings, meaningful indicators that people can deal with at the local level. The centralized, globalized, one economic term is not going to work anymore. We have to find ways of aggregating information, meaningful, substantive information and values that people can live with and, well, not dominate or kill other species. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. David, please.
Thank you very much. I would like to change or go back to the framing that we started with in this webinar. The whole question of political economy, the whole question of the integration of production and consumption, and the reframing of the problem. Because it's my experience here in Latin America that we are more successful when we abandon the nation state as the unit of organization. I understand that that's a very, very big problem for many people in the audience, because the kinds of organizations and institutions of the nation state have been captured by capital, have been captured by the large corporations and by the financial organization on an international level. But people would ask me, well, are there alternatives? Are there kinds of organizations that provide a different way, not of growth or degrowth, but rather the kind of living that is developing under global capitalism, as opposed to the alternative forms of the organization of life? I would like to give a few examples. One, which perhaps is known very, very superficially among much of the audience, is the Zapatista Army for National Liberation here in Mexico. People perhaps don't have a notion that this involves 500,000 people who have reclaimed a territory in Mexico, within Mexico, that is larger than the country, the Netherlands. 500,000 people living in an area that is larger than the Netherlands, that have over more than a quarter of a century substantially improved their quality of life, substantially involved themselves in rebuilding and reconstructing the environment, and developing ways of self-organization in spite of a concerted effort by military forces to try to create a guerrilla warfare on their edges. Right now, the Zapatistas have sent several delegations now to Europe to try to implement their notion of global international solidarity. And I think that it's really important to understand that these movements in Europe they're not as large as the Zapatista movement, but they represent alternative framing of the way in which society is organized, not simply different indicators, but different ways of having a self-organization in developing autonomy. I would like to give several other examples. We have the exciting example of Bolivia, whose government has reclaimed the initial impetus to create a plurinational state, which is trying to bridge the gap between local development efforts and the problem of national economic development. Right now, you also have the case where you have a struggle in Chile of people who are rewriting the constitution that was written under the dictatorship and will, by the end of the year, be presented, during the course of next year, be presenting an alternative constitution to implement some of these very, very important ideas. And out of India, you have the initiative of the Global Tapestry of Alternatives, which involves hundreds of communities around the world that are systematically organizing their information about the way in which they're going about trying to create a different way of looking at the problem rather than the growth, degrowth binomial, which I think, and I think much of our discussion today has shown, doesn't lead anyway. I think that we have to accept, we have to be grateful that the degrowth movement has changed part of the dialogue. But the important thing about that is in much of Europe is that it has not focused on the question, is the nation state itself a way of going forward, or are we going to have localism, which is not small isolated communities, but communities that are joined in international networks like the Via Campesina and the Territories of Life that I mentioned in my initial remarks. So I would like to talk about a concept of changing the world, not changing the way in which we think about the problem of consumption, but changing the organization of the way in which people can develop and organize and manage a different style of life and develop the international alliances which are extraordinarily important to allow each of the individual efforts to become part of a worldwide movement. Thank you very much.
Great.
Yeah, if I may barge in there, because I'm sorry, the raise hand option is somehow not available to me, but I wanted to comment on what David just said. I completely agree, and listening to this entire webinar, that thought came to my mind also, that really it's a problem of political economy and a deficit in democracy, because what we are seeing is not rational decision making. It's only rational from the perspective of vested interests. So these people are not stupid either. They're not, they're simply pursuing their own benefit. So it's really a corrupt system that we have. And that includes some of the most functional democracies on the planet. I happen to live in Germany. I think it's not too bad, but still, it's not what goes down, let's say, in the agriculture ministry is not rational. It's only comprehensible. It's only rational from the perspective of vested interests. And to fight that is not easy. It's not easy because they've got the guns, they've got the money, they've got the influence, the lobbies and all that. But like David, I'd also say that grassroots meetings can change things. For example, in Indonesia, where I work on sustainable farming movements, that number of members in the millions, closely linked to La Via Campesina also, I think they're really accomplishing something by working independently of government support, bumping into laws that obstruct them, for example, from seed saving every now and then, but finding ways to pressure the government because they are so large. So yes, I think that's one option, and I think scientists have to really become more politicized and more willing to put themselves on the line to bring about change. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. Thank you. We are running out of time, and there are 15 or 16 questions in the chat box. We'll obviously share the questions with the panelists and invite them to, maybe they have time to respond to these. But I'll just read out a couple of them, and we'll see if we can make much progress. I don't think so, but let me just ask one or two of them at least. I think on this point about I think confronting power, I think there's a very relevant question, very straightforward question. I think is, how do you see corporates reimagining the future of growth without relying on tapping into consumerism? What kind of social impetus do you think would be required to fix the system? I mean, it assumes that the corporate side of the world would actually make an initiative in this direction. But how do you get? I mean, so that is the existing power center, right? And so the question is, how do you get corporates to change without relying on consumerism? This is the kind of, I guess, the I'm forgetting the name of the company, but green products and stuff like that, right? The outdoors company. I'm forgetting their name right now, but yeah, that's just one question. And there's another interesting question about the role of youth, and I think it's useful. It's probably directed at David. This regards the communitarian revolutionary subject. How are youth involved, and how are their needs being addressed? There is a lot of discussion that knowledge is not a barrier. How do we then make a difference with the young generation? What does that mean for the future employment, quality of life, etc.? So young people and corporate power, I suppose. And this, unfortunately, will have to be, at least as far as the official session is concerned, this will have to be the last word. You're welcome to stay on.
Sorry, yes. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but just on the corporate question, I'm not going to take the youth one at all. That's Professor Barkin's take. But corporate, let's just go back to the history of corporate. That is, when does that happen? Towards the end of the second industrial revolution in the US, not in Europe. Right? In Europe, the first industrial revolution is still led by private capital, that is individuals. Yeah, that is, the second industrial revolution is when this institutional innovation called the corporate public listed companies come in, where the profit is not just to the individual capitalist or the owner, but the profit is to a whole range of shareholders. Right? Now, that institutional innovation is deeply problematic because it builds this capitalist system throughout society. Yeah, I can own 10,000 shares and make money out of, yeah. Now, we have to rethink institutional innovations that came up towards the end of the second industrial revolution. There's a lot in Veblen, there's a lot of literature of that sort, again, rich literature that talks about institutionalization of a deadly process through public listing. We also have the escape, that is, you can get out, the risk minimizing, because you're not losing money just yourself. There's a whole range of stakeholders also will go kaput if you lose, right? So there's a way in which risk, uncertainty in the industrial, after the 1893 dip during the second industrial revolution, there is the origin of the corporate profit and the corporate entity is also something that, if we are serious about climate change, we're not just going to change technologies and carbon emissions now, we also must change institutions that came about during the industrial revolution and get back to some place where there are sustainable, localized institutional arrangements that are possible. Thank you.
Thanks.
I have a word.
Please, David, go ahead. Yes.
I think that the question that you raised and that I'm trying to raise of power is really extraordinarily important and central to this. The question of, can we you posed this question, Manu, can we reframe and expect the corporations to change? And my response is no. They have an internal dynamic of profit maximization and capital accumulation, which inevitably and necessarily leads to inequality and concentration, not only on an individual scale, but on a global scale. And so I think that we have to emphasize the initiatives at the local level And I think that the one question that stuck in my mind about the youth, the important thing about the communitarian revolutionary subject is that it's an intergenerational transfer, not only of work, not only of formation of human people, of human beings as rounded, multidimensional beings, but also the transfer of the extraordinary wealth of knowledge with which we began with. Raina talked about it in her first comment. We know so much. We understand among many people, but the people who have much of the most sensitive knowledge are the people who are not being permitted into the international scenes. And they're trying to work on the local levels, which is the global tapestry of alternatives, which is the Via Campesina, which are the territories of life. I think that we have to understand the knowledge is there. We have to create mechanisms to let it flower.
Could I also just make one final point?
Yes, please.
Thank
Yes.
you. Yeah, and I will be brief, honestly. So look, I think this has been an extraordinarily rich discussion, and especially the comments in the chat are really very, very interesting and raise all kinds of concerns. I just want to make a plea not to let the best be the enemy of the good. And I think that's a failing all of us have. We all want huge transformational revolutionary change. But as David has repeated, we are dealing with extraordinarily powerful forces at every level, economic, political, social, cultural. They are extraordinary forces, very, very powerful on the other side. So I think we really have to be ready to do whatever it takes. And I mean that at every possible level. I mean, yes, we do the local, the regional, we develop as many as possible of all of these alternatives. We try and give power to those. We look at all possible strategies, including, developing some other indicator. I agree with Rajeshwari. We need as many as possible. We need a much wider approach, but we also need to develop options that can be used. And the two should not be in contradiction with each other. We need to talk to anyone who will listen. We need a broad, united front. We shouldn't be wasting our time fighting with each other. We really have to think of very, very broad coalitions and do whatever it takes at every possible level. I just want to end with that. Thanks.
Okay. I think we'll have to make that the last word. A call for unity and an appreciation of the enormity of the question challenges confronting us. It's past 8, and so of course the chat we will download the chat and we'll share the chat with the participants. I also just want to make a quick plug for the next 2 webinars in this series. The next one's on September 22nd, and the title is Delineating Notions of the Good Life Beyond Consumerism in the Global South. And the third one is on September 28th, where we, I think, take on the political question more directly, talking about building knowledge action solidarities. So I hope all of you will definitely join us for that, these 2 webinars as well. And certainly I have to thank the panelists for their time, their thoughts, their ideas, their energy. Much appreciated. Thank the audience. My apologies, we weren't able to get through all the questions, but we have certainly recorded them and we share them, right? But thank you so much for making the time to join us. And thank you all again. Take care. Bye-bye. Have a good day or night or whatever it is.
Thank you also.
Thank you.